Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. Buenos dias. This is Super Wednesday at the Inter-American Dialogue, and we'll see who comes out ahead here. This is intended. This is a session intended to lift everybody's spirits. So we thought we'd have a session on Venezuela after Super Tuesday. So this is well timed. I had a professor in graduate school many years ago who was always critical of graduate students because they overused the term crisis. And when there was sort of a few problems or a few concerns or a few challenges, graduate students always said it's a crisis. And so this professor really was very critical of the graduate students. But I think in the case of the situation in Venezuela, even that old professor would probably acknowledge and concede that the term crisis probably applies. I think all of us in this room are aware of the data about inflation, negative growth, fiscal deficit, and of course we've also seen a lot of the photos and images of many Venezuelans waiting in line for basic goods, which I think reflects dire reality in the country. Given the huge gap in financing with imports already slashed in Venezuela, there is increasing talk about a possible default this year in 2016 and what that might mean. So we're going to talk about that this morning. There's also a lot of speculation about different political scenarios, whether the current government of Nicolas Maduro can last under such tremendous strain and pressures and stress, and other options and alternatives that might be possible in Venezuela. It's been nearly 2 months now since the opposition has been in control of the National Assembly after they won a supermajority in December, delivering a very powerful blow to the Bolivarian revolution. We're going to talk about what we've seen so far from the opposition and what its strategy is and what its strength is as well moving forward. This morning, we're going to have a discussion about the current state of affairs in Venezuela and what we can expect in the coming months, both on the economic and political fronts. There's no one better prepared to lead that discussion this morning than our main speaker, who's Michael Penfold. Many of you know him. He's a professor of political economy at IESA in Caracas, former director of public policy at the CAF Development Bank of Latin America. Also the founder and executive director of Strata Apoyo Empresarial. Michael has written extensively on politics in Latin America and, of course, has written a lot on Venezuela in particular. He's co-authored a book with Javier Corrales called Dragon in the Tropics, published by Brookings, which covers the Chavez period and just came out with a second edition, I guess, last year, which also deals with the Maduro government as well. Michael is a great friend, and we're very fortunate and happy that he's kindly agreed to share his thoughts with us this morning. He's come up to Washington for a few days, so we thought we'd aprovechar his presence to lead us in a discussion on Venezuela. To share some comments, we're also thrilled to have with us Risa Grace Targo, who's a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group, focuses on macroeconomic policy and politics in Venezuela, which is more than a full-time job. I think Risa really devotes a lot of time to all of the issues in Venezuela and tracks developments there very closely, not only day to day, but probably hour to hour, and gets all that information out to her clients about what's going on in Venezuela. So we're very grateful to Risa for joining us this morning and sharing her thoughts. Our second commentator is Kevin Casas Zamora, who's a senior fellow here and director of our Rule of Law program at the Dialogue. Kevin's also a political scientist, former vice president of Costa Rica, who's held high-level positions at the OAS and before that at the Brookings Institution. He's written extensively and writes extensively on democracy and rule of law questions and has written some excellent pieces as well, focused particularly on Venezuela, which is clearly a very problematic case. So we look forward to Kevin's remarks as well. And after that, we're going to open it up to all of you for comments and questions. Look around the room. I see a lot of people here with a lot of knowledge and expertise about Venezuela, and so we look forward to a great exchange and discussion. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Michael.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a real honor to be able to share the panel with Risa and with my dear friend Kevin. Happy to see him here. You're hiring really well. It's great to have him here. I want to focus my presentation on Venezuela. First of all, on trying to dimension or to provide an idea of the depth of the economic crisis, which is the underlying variable that is moving the whole political equation in the country, and the size of the macroeconomic imbalances and the microeconomic distortions that Venezuela is facing is really at the heart of the basic problems that the country is facing today. Based on that, I want to move into the political context, what it means, but more importantly, I want to argue that, you know, if you look at what's going on from a perspective of the Chavismo, even from that perspective, the current equilibrium, political equilibrium in Venezuela is totally unsustainable. And I'll try to explain why I think that's the case. And then I want to move ahead and try to look at the different paths that the country might move into in the next few months, and look at the pace of change. And I think here's where the critical conflict between the different groups are. I think Chavismo is going to move, but it's going to move into a pace where they can control the process of political change without necessarily calling for a new election, but actually renewing its leadership. I think the opposition wants to move much faster and precipitate a presidential election this year. And then you have another factor that no one controls, that is the social crisis. And I wanted to go into that variable in depth, because I think that's a critical variable, but it's a wild card. And it's going to, in many ways, determine also the pace of change in the country in the next few months. When you look at the economy in Venezuela, there are three different types of crises going on right now. And they're all quite big, and they're all very significant. You have a balance of payment crisis. You have an external crisis. Part of it has to do with a decline in oil prices, which makes the country unable to continue financing the current levels of imports. And in fact, the country has been slashing imports tremendously in the last few years. Another part of that crisis has to do with debt payments that are due this year and next year, particularly for PDVSA. And you have also a crisis that is linked to the lack of confidence in the currency at this point. So you have a country that's basically depleting its international reserves, and you have a country that is dealing with this massive external problem without access to financial markets, and with a country that doesn't want to deal also, or a government that doesn't want to deal with multilateral organizations in order to ease some of this pain. So this is a tremendous constraint on the economy. We have a second problem, which is a fiscal problem. We have a deficit that is over now 20% of GDP. It's just huge. And part of that deficit right now is due to overvalued exchange rate, where the central bank is basically financing monetary PDVSA. And this is creating huge inflationary pressures. And then you have a third element, which is a productivity collapse. I mean, basically, the business sector collapsed in Venezuela. So you have a country that basically cannot grow unless there is some dramatic change in economic policy making. I'm very bleak in the short term on the effect of this situation on the population. Because basically what's happening is that you have part of this adjustment has been done through real wages and reducing real wages for Venezuelans who are struggling to adapt to these different crises, the external, the fiscal, and the productivity crisis. So here the question is, well, what's going to happen is you already you have an economy that's basically in the last 3 years has lost over a quarter of its GDP. So it's a massive crisis. It's huge. You have a country where relative prices do not exist. So you don't have a price system right now, and therefore you have arbitration, you have an economy of extraction, and you have a government that has been subsidizing the supply of products rather than people directly to buy some of these subsidized goods, whether it's for food or medication. And this has created an enormous opportunity for arbitration. You have scarcity that is also linked to this collapse of the private sector in particular. So you have an economy that is contracting very rapidly. You have real wages that are contracting very rapidly. You have a very high levels of inflation that is moving towards hyperinflation at this point. And the expectations of things changing in the near future for people on the ground is basically very low. So almost 75% of the population think that their situation is worse off today than it was last year, and they don't think it's going to improve in the near future. So that is sort of the context. And then obviously you have a context where oil prices have lost ground tremendously in the last year or so. And you have a country that this year requires over $26 billion in financing with no access to financing. So it's huge. So we're talking about a real issue. And this is a real issue for the country. It's not only an issue that the government is facing, it's the whole country is facing the dramatism of that economic situation. Last year, the government was facing a similar financing requirement, and they were all able to close partially that gap. First of all, slashing imports, okay, which has obviously an enormous social cost, particularly when you have no domestic production to substitute those imports. You started selling assets, so we sell the refinery, and we also moved to ask for lines of credit to China, and there was a $5 billion line of credit from China. And then we also managed to negotiate with Jamaica, with Dominican Republic, with Uruguay, repaying at a discount existing debt with these countries. And and by using also part of what we had in international reserves, the country was able, at a huge cost, to move on, to sort of, in the context of an electoral year, to close partially that gap. Well, this year, the gap is similar, and we have less assets available. And the liquidity crisis is even worse than it was last year. So we have when you start looking at that situation there, it's a real source of concern. The government so far has been trying to repeat the same strategy that we had last year. And in fact, for example, last week, 2 weeks ago, the president of PDVSA announced that they had sold some equity from Petromonagas that Rosneft was buying, and we also heard that other companies such as Chevron and the Chinese were negotiating similar deals with PDVSA. So this is the economic context in which the political crisis is taking place. This is also happening in the context of a collapse of public services, which adds to the economic situation a totally different dimension, but a very important dimension from a social perspective. This is true for water, this is true for electricity, and this is true for citizen security. So you have over 30% of the population that says that they have more than 3 times electric rationing a week. You have over 45% of the population saying that they're experiencing water rationing of some sort every week. And you have half of the population that is saying that they have been victim of some type of crime. So, and a lot of the protests that you're seeing today have to do not only with the economic situation, but in fact with the crisis that we're starting to see in public services. Add to that a situation where you have shortages in medicines and food over 70%. So in medicines, for example, it's not that you can choose whether you're going to import or not certain medicine. People just, get sick. So you need to have all medicines available. Well, there's, important numbers of treatments are just not available. And the shortages are really important. So I give this as sort of the backdrop to the political situation, which is, I'm sure, what many of you want to hear about, and what my thoughts are on this issue I'm going to try to share with you. I think that there's no doubt at this point that Chavismo has been losing competitiveness electorally, and the results from the legislative election is a clear sign of that situation. It's a movement, it's a political party that still obtained 42% of the votes. So it's still it's still the largest minority in the country, and that's important to realize. But it's a minority that wants to govern as if it still holds a hegemonic position within the political system, and it's lost that. It's lost that aura in the last 4 years in Venezuela. And you have a coalition within Chavismo that is changing also very quickly, and that has changed in the last few years in important ways. Before, you had a clear leadership that was calling decisions, that governed that coalition, that reshaped that coalition at its will, and that was President Chavez. And now you have a leader that is clearly a leader of a coalition with very heterogeneous interests, and where he has to renegotiate permanently his political decisions, and has, as a result, fragmented the economic policy-making process, and actually also given more power to the military than what they had in the previous years. So you have a coalition within Chavismo that has been reshaped and that has lost electoral competitiveness in the last few years. Nonetheless, and I insist on this, it's still a very relevant and a very important political actor. Now, the dimensions of the Venezuelan conflict are diverse. You have part of that conflict has to do with the economic reforms and the needed economic reforms and how the political process will help or not to share the cost of those reforms. And that's a conflictive issue. You have another dimension of the crisis that is linked to the president himself and whether he's sustainable or not, or whether he needs to be removed or not, and how you're going to do that through the Constitution, through an electoral process, and in peace. Okay. You have conflicts over the electoral calendar, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this. You have a very important electoral calendar coming up. You have elections for governors by the end of this year. You have elections for mayors by the end of next year, and you have presidential elections in 3 years. And guess what? That electoral cycle, given the economic and social situation in Venezuela, for Chavismo is unsurmountable from an electoral perspective. And that's what I think is a very important driver for change in Venezuela, is that that electoral calendar at this point is unviable for Chavismo, and therefore they need to accept, or we will have to look for some way of how to change that. You have a country where you need to renew public authorities, and you have a Congress or a National Assembly where the opposition clearly had a two-thirds majority. You had a ruling from the Supreme Court in order to mute the qualified majority that the opposition had by suspending the deputies from the opposition and also the coalition from the government from the assembly. And basically, you have a Supreme Court that is now trying to contain the powers of the National Assembly and the ability of the National Assembly to control, to monitor, or to push a legislative agenda in the country. So this is a situation that is also conflicted, and you're running right now into a clash of branches of power or divided government, as you wish to call. But at the end, the real conflict there is renewing these authorities and whether the opposition and the government will able to protect the current appointments or be able to renew them. You have political prisoners in Venezuela too. And you have an amnesty law that needs to be negotiated with the government and is also a very important part of that conflict. So you have overall not only an economic situation that is extremely complex, a social situation that is quite dramatic, but you have a political juncture that is also very complex and it has different dimensions. Now, regretfully, at this point, what you have at hand is not a negotiation. That's not what's on the table. On the table is a conflict between a group that thinks that they are going to be able, through the Constitution, by a recall referendum or an amendment to remove the president, and you have an executive branch and an official party that wants to resist this possibility. Now, when you look at this conflict, you start and you look at the electoral cycle, you start realizing what the windows of opportunity for change in Venezuela are in this context, okay? Because I think that the game is not that whether Venezuela is it's between protecting the status quo or changing. I think even the Chavistas want to change the status quo. It's unsustainable from an economic point of view, from a social point of view, and from a political point of view, because there's no way, again, that they're going to be able to win this electoral cycle that is coming up. Now, in a normal situation, a normal economic and social situation, what the opposition should do in Venezuela is to wait. That's what they should do, wait. Now, but given the economic and social dramatism of the current situation, you cannot wait because you need to take actions. I mean, you need to solve and address these macroeconomic imbalances. You need to stabilize the social situation, and you need to come to terms with the political crisis. So what you have is a situation, an electoral cycle, where there's the fourth year cutoff. And I'm going to take some time with this. And I think this is key to understand what I think Chavismo is playing out and how they're going to try to play it out. And is after the fourth year, if the president resigns or is revoked, the president will be the vice president. You don't need to call a general election, a presidential election. Before the fourth year, okay, if the president resigns or is revoked, okay, you would have to call for a presidential election. So the key question here is, well, when does this presidential period start? And here now we're not in hand of lawyers, right? I mean, we're in hand of a political interpretation of the Constitution. And by the way, an interpretation that is difficult because Maduro was elected to end a presidential period for which another president, President Chavez, was elected. So here you have different interpretations of when this fourth year cutoff takes place. You could have an interpretation that says, no, it's in October this year because, you know, the presidential period started, as the Supreme Court said when they had the thesis of the administrative continuity, that justified the temporal absence of President Chavez when he was sick, that this starts in October 2012, and therefore the fourth cutoff year would be October 2016. If you follow the Constitution, it clearly says that it's on the 10th of January. So you would have a fourth year cutoff that is in January. And there might be a ruling saying, no, the presidential period starts when he was elected. That is, in April 2013, and therefore the cutoff, the fourth year cutoff, will be on April 2017. Now, these are months of difference. But in this context, they're extremely important, okay? And they make a difference. I think that the Chavismo is playing the game of holding off until the fourth year and then controlling a transition from within. That is what I think is what they're aiming at. Maybe President Maduro doesn't want that, but I think at the end it's not only Maduro who's making decisions, he's part of a bigger coalition. And I think the bigger coalition is probably asking themselves, how are we going to survive this electoral cycle and in this economic and social crisis? So I think that's what they're playing. This, you know, resisting until the fourth year cutoff. I think the opposition needs to accelerate the constitutional exit that they're going to choose, whether it's a recall referendum or an amendment. But they only have between 8 months and 14 months to activate this process, depending on when this fourth year cutoff is. If they're able to activate this window, this constitutional window, before that fourth year cutoff, they're going to be a very important player in the transition. And they're going to have they're going to force Chavismo to negotiate an outcome. If it's done after the fourth year, if they're unable to do that after the fourth year of cutoff, I think the leverage that the opposition has is going to be considerably reduced. Why? Because the opposition regretfully lost their qualified majority when the Supreme Court ruled that the Masonic deputies were temporarily removed. You know, this is the game. 3 minutes. What is the best option then for the opposition? What is the faster way in this window, in this time of this window of opportunity of 8 to 14 months that they have to move forward and accelerate the process of change? Well, I think the option of the amendment, which is basically reducing the years of the presidential term, and not only the presidential term, they're talking also about reducing the period of the legislative branch and the judicial branch, I think sounds great, but I think that's an option that at the end is going to end up in the Supreme Court, in the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court is going to rule at its, saying, well, you can vote it, but you cannot apply it retroactively. So it doesn't apply to this presidential period. Or they might say this is not an amendment, this is a constitutional reform, and that therefore, other conditions are applied. So I think it's an option that sounds great if you're in a negotiation, but if you're not in a negotiation, which is what I think is what's happening today, I think it's a very vulnerable option. The other option is a recall referendum. And of course, we went through a recall referendum in 2004. We're still, the blisters are still there, stitches, it was traumatic. So people are saying, like, do we have to go through that process again? And I think the country it has no other alternative but to go through that process again. Now, the good news is that compared to 2004, in 2004, we didn't have a CNE, so part of the negotiation was getting a CNE. You didn't have a procedure of how to collect signatures. Now you have a procedure actually validated by the Supreme Court on how to collect signatures. And of course, the government incentive is to obstaculize the recall, but I think once the opposition unites behind it, they're going to be able to activate it. So that's where the conflict stands. Now there's a third process that no one's controls. That is a social crisis. And this is a wild card because it's very difficult to project whether you're going to have massive lootings or riots or, I'm not in that business, and it's difficult to project whether that's going to happen or not. But what is true is that we have clear signals that might happen because you have protests, you have events, isolated events of social unrest, and you have a population that is clearly signaling that their limits to the current economic situation is coming close to over the yellow line. So that's a wild card. Now, if you have an event of certain scale, I think that event is going to be interpreted by the military group as a signal not to step in. I don't think they're going to step in. I think they've been very clear that they're going to play by the constitutional rules. And I think that's what Venezuela needs, by the way. We need to play within this constitutional scheme. However, I understand that the interpretation is biased and all that, but I think you have to play within this scheme. But it's going to accelerate many different processes within the existing political situation. So I think that that event might be sort of a trigger that might accelerate a political change. To conclude, I think, first of all, Venezuela is heading towards a deepening of its economic crisis this year. And next year. There's no way we can get out of this without a credible, a coherent set of new economic policies. The good news is that in the long term, when you look at the balance of payment crisis, when you look at the characteristics of the external problem that Venezuela is facing, there's only one solution to that problem, which is to open the capital account and to flexibilize the exchange rate control system. Okay? There's no other solution to that problem. I think that the cost for Chavismo of keeping the status quo is so high that even Chavismo is going to look for a solution. Now, it's a solution that is going to serve their interests, not necessarily the interests of the opposition or the interests of other groups. And I think the opposition has a dominant strategy in the short term, which is to try to activate some of these options in order to force an exit that would force, in turn, Chavismo to come to the table and negotiate an agreement. Now, the wild card is a social variable. It's a variable that no one controls, but it's a variable that it's so, the situation there is so dramatic that it's going to carry its own weight. So I'll leave it there, Michael.
Terrific. Thank you very, very much, Michael. That was very clear and comprehensive. Thank you. Thank you for lifting our spirits and making us. Risa.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to lift your spirits further, but I'll give it a shot. Thanks for the invitation to be here. And Michael had asked me to comment a bit on the economic side of the story in particular, and then I'll share some thoughts on the political and social variables as well. So first, I wanted to focus on the recent measures that the government has taken, because I think it's a big story in the sense that Maduro did something, right? I mean, this is a president that has resisted any sort of real economic adjustment since he assumed office for fear of political costs. And the fact that they did a devaluation and did touch the gasoline subsidies in particular, I think is significant. And I think that tells you that there is some recognition internally that they have a problem. The issue I see is that it's too little too late in terms of these adjustments. And, you know, they both provide the government with a bit more fiscal breathing room, but neither of them addresses the main problem of the economy, which is foreign exchange. So, you know, because, you know, gasoline in Venezuela went from being the cheapest in the world to being the cheapest in the world, you know, it's not going to change consumption patterns. Arbitrage opportunities with Colombia still exist. So that change doesn't increase PDVSA's cash-generating exports, and that's key here, right? Likewise with the devaluation. I mean, it's a big devaluation of the official rate, but with the parallel now over 1,000, and the rest of the economy, you know, as Michael said, I mean, virtually the non-oil economy has shrunk so much that it's not enough, I think, to change consumer demand for imports or create incentives for some sort of import substitution. And again, you know, when the government has been going around and having meetings with the private sector about engines of growth, I mean, the private sector tells them, we need dollars. So this fundamental problem that the economy has is that is the foreign exchange side. And here, obviously, you know, the external environment and the oil prices is really critical. And you know, looking at the numbers, I mean, the government, you know, last year already saw its oil income, you know, essentially halved. You know, if we are on pace with this current price, if you know, so far this year, Venezuela's oil basket is averaging $24 per barrel. You know, doing some quick math, I mean, that's something like $17 billion in oil revenue, whereas a couple of years ago it was $65 billion, right? So this is just a huge shock. And to the extent that this is the government's only source of foreign exchange, I mean, it all depends on oil. As Michael outlined, you know, last year the government was able to do a lot of kind of one-off measures to be able to service their debt, to be able to maintain imports, even though they did cut them by 20%. But this year, I think it's going to be much more difficult. I mean, for one, they've done all the easy options, right? The Petrocaribe members that are left, like Cuba and Nicaragua, they don't have market access, so they can't do similar deals like the ones done with the DOMREP and Jamaica. The asset sales, I mean, there isn't that much left to sell, and the government ended up leveraging Citgo instead of selling it. They're now already liquidating the gold that's in Venezuela, which I think tells you how few the other assets they have are, because that's always, I think, kind of been the last to go. But they're moving the gold out of Venezuela to do swaps, so I think that tells you that we're already scraping the bottom of the barrel. And those reserves are now at 13.5 billion. It's a 17-year low, and they don't have that much to work with. Looking at their financing needs, I agree with Michael. I mean, we're talking about 25 to 30 billion this year just to maintain debt service and basic imports. I think the government is still very much committed to servicing their debt. They, as I'm sure you guys know, they made a major payment last week. And I think they'll continue to pay for as long as they can. But the issue is that it's of capacity, right? And I also think that their ability to cut imports like they did last year is also, I think, compromised by the political and social variables. They did slash imports last year by 20%, but they paid a political cost for it in the elections. And I think that that's going to be very difficult this year. So our expectation is that the government will, do everything in its power to pay, but probably default in the fourth quarter when collectively between PDVSA and the sovereign, they owe close to $5 billion in maturities and interest. And that's going to be a messy process. I think because the government is going to kind of keep paying until they can't, it's going to be a disorderly default. The negotiations with creditors are going to be probably drawn out, and they're going to be complicated by the political uncertainty and depend a lot on who's sitting across the table from creditors when that happens. But any sort of restructuring is going to have to include a credible plan for the economy, and right now there isn't one, right, in terms of in looking at the longer term. So this year, I think, it's shaping up. I completely agree with Michael. I think every year in Venezuela feels like the make or break year, but I think this is really it. and it is looking very, very challenging on the economic front. On the political front, I agree with Michael that the game here for Chavismo is to get to 2017. My view is that they are going to impede any institutionalized or constitutional path to regime change. I think they've shown with their moves around the National Assembly, first with the 3 deputies and then with the economic emergency decree, that the government is willing to use the Supreme Court to really contain the opposition, and I think that they'll continue to do that. So, if there's an amendment, they'll use the Supreme Court. But I think with a recall vote as well, I mean, I think that's something that they can delay until 2017 relatively easily. And so, assuming that the opposition does start to organize in April, when we look at all of the different kind of time frames that are involved in the recall process, even in a scenario in which it all goes smoothly, it's about 5 months. So we're already looking at the fall. And I think that Chavismo can find creative ways to delay it. I mean, like as they did in the recall vote to remove Chavez, you can say that the signatures aren't valid. You can question those. You can create roadblocks, I think, that push it into 2017. And so I see Chavismo as, as frustrated as they are with Maduro, I think he's still, for now, represents their most stable equilibrium, and this year in particular, right? Because, again, no one wants to go to an election, which they would surely lose. And another issue is who's going to be the candidate. I mean, Chavismo is a very divided movement in itself, and I think agreeing on who a successor would be is going to be a whole other challenge. So So I think that the government's ability to maintain this strategy, essentially to put off a recall vote, is going to be completely dependent on the social dynamics. And I agree with Michael that I think that is just the key catalyst to watch in Venezuela, and it's obviously very difficult to predict what the catalyst is going to be when that social explosion scenario is going to happen. But I do think that the social conditions are ripe for something more acute. You know, last year we had the elections kind of anchoring expectations, and I think the fact that we had the elections and nothing is changing, I think is going to contribute to frustration very quickly. The goods scarcity is just becoming all the more problematic, and I think that when people, there's been kind of a substitution effect that, you have to wait in line for a long time, you have to maybe put some, buy pork instead of chicken, but you can still find food to feed your family. I think that once that becomes more frustrated, and it seems that it will in terms of looking at the foreign exchange limitations this year, that's going to become, all the more problematic for the government as well. And then finally, I think one key variable that's been missing over the last year or so is what's the viable alternative? I mean, why would people go out into the streets if you don't know that whatever is going to come next is going to be better? And I think, the opposition still has its problems, but to the extent that they did have this electoral victory, they are more or less united. I mean, they have their divisions, but they're at least trying to act as a unified body. And I think the recall referendum effort, even if you don't get a recall vote this year, I do think it provides them with a national platform and an ability to kind of present alternative views. So I think that also can contribute to kind of mobilizing those social forces. So again, I think the government's ability to survive this year is going to be completely dependent on the social. If we do get into that social explosion scenario, I think that is the variable that changes the incentives for stakeholders within Chavismo. And I think that's probably a fairly disorderly process. And I think even if we make it to next year, the issue I see is that right now, the magnitude of distortions in the economy is so great that undoing those distortions, whoever does it, whether it's an opposition government, whether it's a new Chavismo government, it's potentially destabilizing. I mean, the amount, the size of the devaluation that you have to do. I mean, lifting capital controls, absolutely the answer, but as soon as you do that, then money just flows out of the country, right? I mean, you need some sort of coordinated plan. So I do think regime change is on the horizon. I think, but I guess my sense is that the transition is not necessarily going to be a smooth one, and that whoever comes next, it's going to be very challenging in terms of maintaining political stability and finding a path out of this crisis, and complicated by the fact, again, that I think that there will be a credit event, and that's going to complicate the financing story as well. So on that rosy note, I'll end my comments and look forward to questions.
Thank you very, very much, Lisa. That was great. Terrific. Kevin.
Thank you, Michael. So it's been left to me to live the spirits now, right? Well, first of all, I mean, I'm very happy to share this panel with Michael and with Risa. It's great to see Michael again. Over the years, I've really admired the things that you've written about Venezuela, and they have informed a lot of my thinking. And I'm also happy to do this because this has forced me to go back to some very good literature that was written years ago on democratic breakdowns and democratic transitions. And that makes for very interesting reading in the current context. And, I'm going to try to make 3 points, and in the process of doing so, I'm going to weave some questions for Michael in the argument. My first point is about something that has struck me not just in the current context, but that has struck me for a long time in Venezuela, which is the apparent irrationality of a lot of the behavior that we see in Venezuela, particularly on the part of the government. And you see signs of that in the decision to double down on a ostensibly failed economic policy. I mean, some of the erratic appointments. I mean, the appointment of this chap Luis Salas a couple of months ago. I mean, this guy that claimed that inflation was a conspiracy and didn't exist, and that sort of thing. I mean, things that really, defy any rational explanation. You see signs of that in the lack of the lack of will, to entertain even any kind of overture towards the opposition. Something, the decisions that are strange to explain, not merely because they might be leading the country down a dead end, but more importantly, and Michael, in some ways alluded to this, because these decisions are leading Chavismo down a road. I mean, the decision to double down on the economic policy is leading Chavismo, in the context of the current crisis, down a road where it is squandering any political capital that it may have for an eventual negotiated exit. It's leading Chavismo to a scenario where Maduro or whoever is in charge of Chavismo ends up playing Galtieri, right? And I find this very, very, very puzzling. And there might be, a lot of possible explanations as to why the government is behaving in such an apparently irrational way. One thing that needs to be said is that in this kind of situation, that there's a lot of irrationality to go around. I mean, we make an effort here, to try to explain the rational options that are available to actors, and actors in practice don't always behave like that. And this is something that I will go back to further on. By definition, a country that is facing the kind of crisis that Venezuela is facing at the moment is doing so because a lot of actors have behaved in irrational ways for a long time, right? So, there are lots of irrationality to begin with, but there might be another explanation, and this is the one that I want to bring to the table, and this is one factor that I would like to ask Michael about, which is corruption. Corruption. It might well be the case that what we're seeing in Venezuela, and there are many signs of that, is not an authoritarian regime, but quite simply a kleptocracy. A kleptocracy where a lot of the actors that are in power really have no shelter but to remain in power. And that explains, the lengths to which they are willing to go to stay in power. And I guess, my question to Michael is, to what extent this is one of the factors that is really driving this story. And I would also like to say that, if this is the case, it appears to be, it is a factor that holds one of the keys to any potential political negotiation. What to do with the colossal levels of corruption that you find in Venezuela, and with those responsible for those levels of corruption and acts of corruption. So this is my first point. The second point is about the potential scenarios, some of which were laid out very eloquently by Michael. Uh, I can see, four potential scenarios, and three of them were already mentioned by Michael. One is the recall referendum. The second is if the institutional exit provided by the referendum fails for whatever reason, you might have demonstrations on the street, and we may argue, how likely that is and how, what are the incentives for the opposition to go into the street. But, it's a potential scenario. The third is the social explosion. And the fourth is a pact of some kind. Let's start with the referendum. The question here, and when it comes to the recall referendum, I think less optimistic than Michael. I mean, Michael has written recently that, and I think that's basically true, that this is the one option where the opposition controls the cards. That is in the hands of the opposition. That unlike the constitutional amendment, it doesn't have to go through the Supreme Court and so on. That's basically true, but the devil is in the details. I mean, the question that I ask myself, I mean, it is true. I mean, there's a procedure now in order to call the referendum. But when you look at the details of the procedure, it's frightening. Really, you have to ask the question of, will the opposition be able to go through all the institutional hoops that the recall implies? It is a process, I mean, for very understandable reasons related to what happened in 2004, the government designed the process to fail. I mean, think of the fact that the opposition has to collect 4 million signatures in 3 days. And those signatures have to be validated by the electoral authority. And before they even get to collect the signatures, they have to go through they have to get all sorts of authorizations from the electoral authority. So my first question is, I think it's almost a rhetorical question in the light of Michael's remarks, if you think the opposition will be able to go through all the institutional hoops that the recall implies. And what I find most interesting about all these potential scenarios is that in 3 out of 4 of those scenarios, that is demonstrations, social explosion, and pact, the armed forces emerge as the big arbiter of politics in Venezuela. Take the demonstrations. I mean, if there are demonstrations, on a very significant scale, at that point, the armed forces must decide whether it pulls the trigger. And that's a very heavy decision to make. If it does, it sends one message, that the government is willing to go to any length to stay in power and that the military supports the government. If it doesn't pull the trigger, it sends an even more powerful message. That military support for the government is not guaranteed. And this decision, as it has happened elsewhere, this decision may well split the military. And one thing we know from the literature about democratic breakdowns and about democratic transitions is that the unity of the armed forces is of paramount importance. I mean, the military will go to almost any length to avoid split in the ranks. And the practical implication of that is that decision, whether it pulls the trigger or not in the face of demonstrations, may well trigger a negotiation. The second scenario, the social explosion, puts the military at the heart of things, because the fact is that if such a thing comes to happen, no political force, certainly not the opposition, will be in a position to control that. I mean, it will be a situation of enemy, and the only actor that can impose a measure of control is the military. And then you have the pact. And no matter how you devise a political pact in Venezuela, the armed forces will be at the center of it. Because as in many other transitions, the assurances given to the military will be at the heart of any negotiation. And as I said before, the armed forces, I mean, it's very easy to see a situation in which the armed forces may well trigger the negotiation. And when you take a glance at what's happening, you know, Maduro is really running out of things with which to buy up the military. You know, the only thing left at this point is handing them direct control of the government. And believe me, that's no prize at this point. So, you know, if the armed forces trigger a political negotiation, one question that I have, which I don't have an answer for, is, and again, going back to the literature and democratic transitions, who are the softliners in the government and in the military that will make a political negotiation possible? And who are the softliners in the opposition, for that matter? But that sort of appears to be more clear. But who are the softliners in the regime, in the government and the military that will allow for a negotiation to take place? The fact of the matter is that, as I see it, almost regardless of the route chosen, the armed forces may end up as the guardian of politics in Venezuela for a long time, which might take different shapes. I mean, it might be, you know, a bad case of guardianship like the case we're seeing in Egypt, or it might be something that gradually washes away, and has happened elsewhere in Latin America. But one only has to recall the example of Chile to see how long this process often takes to play itself out. My third and last point is about uncertainty, and goes back to something that I mentioned before. You know, whenever we have a discussion about these things, I mean, we make an effort to identify the likely scenarios upon the basis of certain parameters of rationality. And when you look at the literature on democratic transitions, uncertainty and contingency are the overarching themes. For many reasons, because there are too many actors, and Michael alluded to this. I mean, that all these political actors that we talk about very often as being monolithic actors are really coalitions. There are just too many actors with different interests, because the actors that are involved in the crisis, you know, they make the decisions looking through the fog of war. And it's very easy to fail to see clearly what your interests are. And very often, you know, actors that are involved in a crisis, such as the Venezuelan current situation, they behave like, and again, there's literature on this in the context of democratic transitions. I mean, they behave like characters in the Greek tragedy that cling to their tragic fate until the bitter end. And one can easily imagine Maduro thinking of himself as Allende. So, again, you know, irrationality is aplenty in the current situation. And, you know, when one reads Arturo Valenzuela's account of the breakdown of democracy in Chile, the coup in Chile should have never happened, but it did. The First World War should have never happened, but it did. So my last point is perhaps a slightly banal one, but it's, I think, it's important to bear to bear in mind, which is, amongst all the doom and gloom in Venezuela, a tragedy in Venezuela is not inevitable. It's not inevitable, if they listen to Michael. But there's no guarantee whatsoever that it will be avoided. One can only hope, but the odds are not good.
Thank you, Kevin. Boy, that was a Costa Rican optimism. Thank you. Well, there are a lot of questions on the table. There are a lot of people here with a lot of knowledge, so I want to open it up now, and we'll collect some questions. Why don't we start right up here with these two guys, because they look like if I don't call on them, I'm going to be in trouble. So,
Michael,
could you tell everybody who you are?
Pedro Borelli from B&B Consulting. I think this is a fantastic panel that just kind of grew and added elements of complexity from a fantastically good piece. What I would like to add as you look at the discussion is the oil crisis in what it means, because what's falling is not Maduro, what's falling is not the revolution, what's falling is the model under which Venezuela has existed for 70, 80 years. Fundamentally, the model that has sustained democracy since 1957. The fundamental issue is that we ran out of an oil model, which is basically that distribution among society are what very few people exploit, because they don't even produce it. They just simply exploit it. The disappearance of the oil economy, when you look in the context of what the offers of the opposition was, and even of the government was in the elections in 2012 and 2013, which was to double the production of oil as a way to get out of trouble, you suddenly find yourself in a situation where oil income, net oil income, once you take all the costs, is zero. So you've actually lost all your income, where you're sitting over 150 or 200 billion barrels of oil with a net present value of zero and no alternative model. So that's a real structural issue that's happened in this country. You run out of a model. This model gave you signs in 83, in 89, in 92, in 94. I mean, it's giving you a lot of signals that it wasn't going on, and we just pretended, a little bit like Kevin's saying, well, we can go on, we can go on. And suddenly, we've got all the crisis layered up. And just to finish, the other point is the military. The assumption of the military as a unified monolithic body, the military, I think, is an integral part of the problem and not that much part of the solution. The way the military was fractured by a paranoid Kuster who was afraid himself of being overthrown, that military, half a part of which is involved in narcotics, part of which is sold out to Cuba, part of which has been outside in the civil administration making money for a long time. You know, when you have 1,000 generals, you know, when there's only about 65 places for generals, where the National Guard is basically a cartel from the top to the bottom, you're not going to get the solution of the military coming in as an institution in the Chile mode. And my sense is that when you look at transitions and you have Spain, Chile, Poland, Hungary, whatever, and then you go to the other end where you have basically now Libya as a worst case, and then maybe Afghanistan, Iraq. Sad to say, because we are very chauvinistic as Latin Americans, we don't believe that we could be there. We're actually closer to the problems of those transitions, to the kind of solutions that we found in more Western environments. The nature of our problems are bigger. The fragmentations, the criminality, the presence of foreign elements in the society will probably make us think that if we ever get to a transition, it's going to be of the most complicated sort and not of this ones that we look as successful.
Thanks, Pedro, for that upbeat. Michael, I'm going to collect some questions and comments. Please be very brief because we're running out of time, and I want Michael to respond, and if we send Kevin, so please be very, very brief.
I'll be a little briefer than Pedro, I promise. Yeah.
Much.
Michael McCarthy from American University Center for Latin American Studies. Really great panel, and if anyone's putting together the study group on rereading O'Donnell and Schmitter, I'll be happy to join. But very quickly, Michael, in your presentation, you glossed over a point that I think is really crucial, which is you seem to hedge and say, I don't think we're in negotiation. So I wanted you to unpack that a little bit, because implicit in everyone's remarks on the panel is that the country's changed. The ground is shifting beneath everyone's feet. So there obviously are conversations taking place. So, you know, as Michael Shifter said in the beginning, we tend to overuse the term crisis, or crisis tends to, you know, connote these very, very dramatic situations. Likewise, negotiation can sometimes imply a very formal process, but in fact, it could also entail a lot of other things. And then, can the panel talk about the international dimensions, please? Because we've gone into the weeds here about Venezuela, but obviously Venezuela is central to all sorts of changes in South America, and it's a key part of U.S. policy without a doubt, despite Cuba being the top of the headlines. So I think it's really important to place Venezuela in a broader conversation.
Great. Thank you very much. Carolina?
Yes,
Marco?
to play or not to play in Venezuela and that impact on international about the Caribbean.
Okay.
Yes, the Petro Caribbean and all that. Yeah.
Okay. Hattie, did you have it? Why don't you give it? Thanks.
I just wanted to make.
Sorry, that was Carolina Barco. This is Hattie Babbitt.
Hattie Babbitt, Global Water Challenge. I wanted to make certain that Michael focused at least a little bit of his time on the role of the military.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we have some questions back there. Sir?
Hi, Joaquin Arias from AICA. I just want to see if the panel can refer to 3 issues. First, remittances. There are so many Venezuelans out of the country sending money, but in a way that is so hard to track. Flow of dollars in the United States or Europe or euros, and flow of bolívares in maybe that is sustaining the crisis in Venezuela, and also expectations. Besides the corruption topic that Kevin was mentioning, the main source of employment in Venezuela is the government. And there is a huge gap between the official exchange rate and the parallel exchange rate. And a point that my wife makes, she's from Venezuela, is these negative expectations about a real and positive change in Venezuela.
Thank you. Sonia, in the back, please.
Hi, Sonia Schott, Schott International Consulting. There are some accusations targeting not just only members of the government, but also the armed forces related to narco trafficking. How this issue is going to affect any possibility of any dialogue between parts? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, we'll go back to the panel. Let me just add, let's get the final question, and then I want to make one to Michael.
Thank you, Cristina. Could you elaborate on the relation between Venezuela and China? Well,
China. Okay. And the question I wanted to ask also, if I could add one to Michael, is, there was selection in December. The opposition did extraordinarily well. What are the people who voted for the opposition expected? And do we have any sense whether they're satisfied of how the opposition is behaving? The recall referendum, the amendment, is that what they want? Do they want something else? Are they disillusioned, or are they saying, well, these are the people we voted for, and they're doing exactly what we hoped they'd do and what we thought they were doing? Do you have any feel for that at all? Why don't we start with Kevin, Risa, and then we'll end up with Michael. If Kevin, do you have any thoughts? And we have about 7 minutes altogether, so we'll have another session later on.
Very, very, very quickly. It's interesting the point that Pedro raised. Pedro, I mean, that might be true in general, but bad as the situation is in Venezuela and corrupt as the military can be and fractured as the military can be in Venezuela, I don't think it's substantially different than other cases that we've had in Latin America in the past that were, up to their knees in corruption, and yet, reasonably orderly transitions happened if political actors and the military were willing to behave rationally. And I mean, I'm not sold on the idea that Venezuela is closer to Libya than to Guatemala in the 80s, right? I mean, it's an interesting discussion. And about the international dimension, yeah, I mean, that's a heck of a question. I mean, and I'm just going to say that for the most part, transitions, save for very, very few exceptions, are largely endogenous processes. I mean, where international actors have a very, very limited ability to influence the way the process evolves. I mean, and in this particular case, I mean, I see no international actor that can really make a difference in Venezuela in terms of nudging the parties towards rationality. I mean, that with the possible exception of Cuba, peculiarly. I mean, I think that Cuba is the one actor that may be able to nudge the government towards behaving rationally if given enough assurances by the opposition, I would imagine, that that their interests in Venezuela will be protected, and that's basically about the supply of oil, which is, by the way, at this point of less consequence for Cuba because, I mean, oil is so cheap all over the place. But other than that, I see no great role for any international actor to play in Venezuela.
Thanks. Risa, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would say actually, I think the international actor with the most influence here is China. I mean, China is this government's largest creditor, and I think is the one actor that has some leverage here. The relationship between Venezuela and China, I think, is a little bit problematic right now to the extent that it was originally based on China's concerns about energy security, and that's no longer an issue right now. China also has its own problems in terms of its growth story, its domestic industry. So I think the nature of that relationship has changed, and we see that in terms of any new deals with China, they tend to be tied to China's new interests. So, for example, guaranteeing that Chinese autos are being purchased in Venezuela with the loans that they're providing. So less about oil and more about Chinese companies, Chinese jobs, et cetera. I think the Chinese are fundamentally concerned about regime change in Venezuela because they have no guarantee that whoever comes next is going to keep paying them, and that's a big concern. And so in that sense, I think that they're willing to work with the government and provide some flexibility on existing loans, potentially pushing out maturities, or find ways to have financing agreements, again, that work to their kind of their current economic challenges. And I think China, to the extent that they think reforms or more substantial economic adjustments help them get to those goals, that they have some leverage with the government. And then very quickly, just touching on the military, I mean, my clients often ask me about a military coup, and I would agree with Pedro that, I mean, this is a military government already, right? So there's no reason to overthrow your own government. But I do think that there's a differentiation between the Guardia Nacional, which is obviously willing to go out in the street and shoot people, and the traditional armed forces, where I think the appetite for exerting real violence on the population at large is very limited. And so that's why I come back to the social catalyst being the one issue that gets everyone at the table. Because if you have a social explosion where the government needs more than the Guardia Nacional to maintain public order, then I think you get into a situation where you say to the armed forces, you have to go out and shoot people, and they say, sorry, Nicolas. And I think these figures, I mean, I think that they are committed to Chavismo to the extent that it keeps them in power, it keeps them making money, and it keeps them out of jail. But the second that they see that Maduro can no longer guarantee those safeguards, I think they'd be willing to come to the table and work out something. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Risa. Michael.
Okay, let me start with your last question, Michael, on what's going on with public opinion, basically. And it's very interesting. I think people in December voted for an economic change more than a political change. I think the voters were concerned about the situation, the economic situation. And so what you had was a voto castigo, a punishment vote. That was massive. That's my own interpretation of that vote. And in fact, when you look at polls today and you compare to those same polls in September last year, it's interesting. Datincorp came out with a recent poll. Support to Chavismo in September 2015, according to this poll, was 23%. Their support today is 22%. Support to the opposition in September 2015 was 46%. According to Datincorp, this February, 46%. So at the level of public opinion, things are freezed at this point. And I think they're freezed because I think voters are trying to figure out whether the government is going to listen and actually produce some significant policy change. I agree with Risa that there has been some adjustment for the gasoline prices. But again, you summarized it brilliantly. It's from the cheapest to the cheapest. But with the FX, we still don't know how the FX is going to work. So there is, in theory, there's going to be a devaluation, but we don't know if PDVSA is going to sell in that market or not. What amount? If that's going to be an open market or not? I mean, it's just uncertain, and that I think is very worrisome. About the issue on rationality and negotiation. If I'm not saying that they're rational, actually, no. If they were rational, they would negotiate. They would provide a mutual guarantee, and they would get out of this mess and share the cost of the adjustment, right? And many countries have done this. You see the Cubans and the Americans. I mean, they're getting along. You have almost 100 flights now from the U.S. to La Habana. I mean, it's amazing, right? You have the Colombians, getting it. But, Venezuelans could do that. I mean, I don't see why. So it's not. So it's actually quite the opposite. It's why this negotiation is not happening. And what is interesting, when you look at the legislative election, the qualified majority was not only surprising, was tremendously important for the opposition because it provided the opposition with a power of negotiation, a credible threat that they did not have. And what did the government do through the Supreme Court? They removed that credible threat, they removed that power, and therefore you have an opposition that has right now no power of negotiation. Why? Because the government at the end, I think, overestimates its ability to get over this political and economic situation on its own terms. I think it's possible, and I think they're going to play this fourth-year cutoff, but I think that the probabilities that might go wrong are quite high. I might be wrong, but I think that's the case. In terms of the transition, I don't think this is I don't think we should read Venezuela through the transition literature, to be very honest. I don't think it adds much because, and this is my own position, I don't think this is the typical authoritarian regime. I think this is a hybrid regime. I mean, I've written a lot about this. And when you're in a hybrid regime, there are three factors that are important. First factor is electoral competitiveness. And this is a very important factor for Chavismo. And it has been a very important factor in Venezuela in the last 15 years. I mean, we've had many elections. They are important in the political game. We might discuss about the rule of law, about democracy, about other elements, but I think the electoral aspect of Venezuela's regime is tremendously important. Second element is the international front. I do think the international front is very important. Not only it's going to play out domestically, it's very important for Chavismo. And I think this is an element that has been changing. The relationship with Brazil has changed. The relationship with Argentina changed because of the political change in Argentina. The relationship with Cuba is changing. It's changing in very important ways. And the relationship with the Caribbean is also changing because, in fact, Venezuela has been cutting subsidies to the Caribbean. They haven't eliminated, but they've been cutting. They've cut that. So I think that the international aspect is tremendously important. And then the final element has to do with the military. I'm no expert about the military. I wish I was. I think it's a tremendously important actor. But, and I hear what you say and I agree, but at the same time I wonder. Because on December 6th, we saw a different military force. We saw a military institution that was saying, look, we're going to play by the constitutional rules. we're not going to get messed up with this political situation. And when it comes to that day, I think that's where the military stands. The military doesn't want to get messed up with the political situation in Venezuela. That doesn't mean that they're going to profit and benefit from participating in other aspects of government, but it means that at the end they're gonna be an arbiter of what the constitutional, how the political conflict is solved within the constitutional framework. That's my own a feeling about where they stand. But again, I'm totally ignorant about the military. I have no idea what goes inside there. And if you know someone who does, I really want to listen to him. I'll end up with two small notes on China and the credit event. I think, there's been a lot of discussion about whether Venezuela should or should not default. I think a default for Venezuela would be extremely costly. And particularly because of the kind of covenants that PDVSA has with investors, where there's no collective action clauses. So it would be messy, as you said. But, to be very honest, even at these oil prices, if we had, a reasonable FX system, if we had, stability, not increasing production, but just stability in the level of production in oil, and you had some normality with a price system, domestic price system, I think Venezuela is in a position to do, to access markets and refine and do a swap. They could, but that's not available. And it's not available not because investors don't want to do that. It's because the government doesn't want to. Because at the end, the government is fixed with this FX system that is ruining the whole country. Now, regarding China, again, China's a little bit like the military, right? We don't know much. It's not very transparent. But something we do know. Well, China approved a line of credit last year of $5 billion. And then in August, President Maduro had to go to China, and they approved another line of $5 billion, which they never disbursed, which is exactly what's happening. The Chinese are just saying, yeah, we approved the line of credit, but, guess what, guys? We're not going to disburse. And we're not going to disburse because we don't know exactly where we're standing. So China, that had been working como un prestamista de último nivel, it's all of a sudden it's not available anymore, right? And there's a lot of talk that the government has been trying to negotiate with the Chinese different deals. There's an infrastructure fund that has almost $8 billion the dollars in the fund for infrastructure projects. So the government wants to tap into that fund. But the Chinese are saying, no, we cannot tap into that funds because these funds are already committed to these infrastructure projects. They're talking about refinancing part of the current debt that is coming to an end this year. Now, at the end, my view is that if the government is able to pursue some not extraordinary, but reasonable economic policy, those financings would emerge or could emerge. And I'll end with this last point about hardliners and the moderates that I think is very important. Where are they? Well, President Maduro did an appointment that I think was his best appointment in 3 years. Aristotle Isturiz as vice president. It's very important appointment. And there's a whole political reading into that. And I think at the end, Aristolo is a very pragmatic politician. Now, does that mean that Maduro is playing the moderate card? Not necessarily. He's also playing the hardliner card. So he's playing on different agendas. And I think he's waiting to see, given the political context, given the social context, given the economic context, he's going to activate one wing or the other. Now, the truth is, and I'll end with this, is that when you have a balance of payment crisis, as large as the one that Venezuela is having today, that's what it is. It's a balance of payment crisis. That divides the government. And it did divide the government very recently because the government, and you had the conflict between Eulogio del Pino, the president of PDVSA, and the vice president of the economy, Luis Salas, precisely because they didn't agree on how to cope with that external problem. Well, so the economic situation, the only thing that does, and that's quite important, I think, is to deepen that division between the more moderate factors and the more and the hardliners. I think at the end, how this is going to play out, again, will depend on the political context. The recall referendum for the opposition, I'm not sure. I'm sure that the government is going to be able to block and to delay the implementation. Maybe they can do that after the fourth year, right? Maybe at the fourth year cutoff. But I think the opposition, they need to gain power of negotiation. They need a credible threat. Right now, they don't have any. They had the two-thirds qualified majority, they lost it. Now they need to regain something in order to force what is rational, which is to negotiate. I'll leave it there.
Good note to end it on. Michael, thank you very, very much. This was absolutely terrific research. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you. And thank you all very, very much for joining us this morning for this session. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you.
Interesting what's going on with rock casting in Venezuela. Follow through. Going back to Caracas today.
Because most people understand that there is no money at any of this.
So write to me at this Gmail or send me a WhatsApp to the phone. Hola, ¿qué tal? Mucho, sí, de buenos amigos ahí.
When I resigned, CFO also
Chévere. Oye, qué bien.
because the government went in and took the money out as dividends after the end of September because we had it and its expectations. And the government continues to spend at a high rate.
Yo tengo una amiga ahí, Alina Rocha Menocal, ¿conoces a Alina? Una mexicana. Trabajamos. Sí, tengo tarjeta. Y escríbeme aquí. Sí, escríbeme al WhatsApp mejor. Ahí. A este teléfono. Sí. Encantado, ¿ah? Hola. Es que yo no sé. Pero te digo, cualquier cosa que te diga y
I think even the fact that they're trying to legislate right now is like,
Yeah.
it's ridiculous.
No, sure, I understand.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody do such a sensible job of landing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, let's get together. I'm here, right across the street. Get coffee or lunch. Hi.